Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being with us here this morning. This is the Agroforestry in Action webinar series. My name is Gregory Ormsby Morey. I'm the Outreach Coordinator with the Center for Agroforestry at the University of Missouri. The Agroforestry in Action webinar series runs approximately monthly. The presentation will run for about 45 minutes with about 10 or 15 minutes of question and answers at the end. After the presentation, I'll open up a Q&A box that participants can submit questions for our speaker. And our guest today is Keefe Keeley of the Savanna Institute. The Savanna Institute, founded in 2013, is focused on the study and promotion of savanna-based restoration agriculture systems across the Midwest of the United States. Keefe is a native of the Kickapoo Valley of Wisconsin. He studied biology at Swarthmore College in Pennsylvania. His research for a Master's of Science in Agroecology at the University of Wisconsin focuses on engaging farmers with their forests. Keefe traveled on a Watson Fellowship to live with farmers in the UK, Zambia, New Zealand, India, and Japan, and has worked in Wisconsin in various capacities at a diversified organic farm with the State Department of Agriculture on local food system development, and with nonprofit organizations in agriculture, conservation, research, and including service as president of Community Conservation Incorporated. Keefe joined the Savanna Institute to support farmers, leading us into a livable future for all. One very interesting part of the Savanna Institute's work, which we're going to hear more about in today's presentation, is the Savanna Institute Case Study Program. Excuse me. The Case Study Program explores the potential of savanna-based systems to become ecologically sound, agriculturally productive, and economically viable alternatives for agriculture in the Midwest. And we'll, again, hear more about that in today's presentation from Keefe Keeley. Keefe, please go ahead. Welcome.
Thank you, Gregory, and thank you to everyone at the Center for Agroforestry and the University of Missouri for hosting this excellent webinar series. It's an honor to be invited to be a part of it, and I want to thank all of you for joining in the webinar today. I don't have my contact information here on the first slide, but it will be on the last slide, and I understand that if you're not able to stay for the entire presentation today, this will be recorded and made available, so you can find the contact there or just go to our website, savannainstitute.org, and I do hope that you'll be in touch if you have any questions or ideas or want to connect with us in any way. That was one of the reasons why I was looking forward to doing this webinar, is to be in touch with folks like yourselves who may want to work with us or learn more about what we're doing. So my title today is Participatory Research and Outreach in Savanna-mimicking Agroecosystems. And that is quite the mouthful, but thankfully we have about 45 minutes here to unpack it. So without any further ado, I'm going to launch into it here. If I can get the slide to advance. There we are. So the key question for us is, can we improve agricultural systems by making them function more like ecosystems? And what I mean by that is, if you look at natural ecosystems, they do lots of things that benefit us humans. And popular parlance for this is ecosystem services. I have my issues with that language, but the point is that ecosystems provide us with things like forest products, habitat for wildlife, and all kinds of biodiversity. They help take care of water and air, sequestering carbon and regulating climate in other ways. They help regulate pests and diseases. The one thing that they don't do very well is produce crops, and particularly food, that humans can use. And there are important exceptions for that, and it varies by ecosystem. But compared to intensive cropland, the number of calories coming off for humans to eat from natural ecosystems is much lower. The problems with intensive cropland are well documented, and I'm not going to go into that in hardly any detail at all today. That's another conversation, but it's being had, I'm glad to see, in many places, the problems that intensive croplands are causing for air and water and climate and biodiversity and even for human health. So we still need the food that this intensive cropland is producing, especially in the Midwest, where a lot of our land surface is covered with intensive cropland. So our hypothesis is that cropland that also produces these other services or performs these other functions might be accomplished by getting cropland to work more like natural ecosystems. And so you'll see at the top of the flower diagram there, crop production might be reduced somewhat, but this is a question of optimization rather than maximization. And so instead of, or in contrast to, approaches that try to take intensive cropland and work at the buffers or the edges to try to mitigate the problems caused by intensive cropland, we're talking about changing or reconfiguring the way that the crops themselves are grown. And our approach to this, I've termed eco-mimicry, because we look to mimic the way that natural ecosystems work. And the field of biomimicry, if you're not familiar with it, probably the most classic example is Velcro, which is designed after the way that burdock will attach itself to fur. And the basic idea is that nature has had 3.8 billion years of research and development, of trial and error. And so our thought is that natural ecosystems perform all these functions that humans also require in addition to crop production. And so might we design crop producing systems that also work that way? And there's lots of other really cool examples of biomimicry and even eco-mimicry in agricultural systems. Range management or managed grazing has seen an explosion of this within the fields of management intensive rotational grazing, mob grazing, patchwork grazing, all designed to mimic the way that large herbivores move in grasslands. But we're not looking at the prairie per se today. We're interested in the savanna. And if you're not familiar with the savanna, one way to describe it is a community characterized by scattered trees with an understory sparse in shrubs and a ground layer rich in grasses and forbs. And this is Pleasant Valley Conservancy in southern Wisconsin here, restored through the efforts of a lot of fire and invasive species removal. The one thing I would add to this description is that savannas also include animals, and we'll talk about that a fair bit today. But why start with savannas? It's a part of our title, and I think it's important, if we're going to mimic an ecosystem, that we understand something about what it is. So I'm going to go through a number of reasons why we might start with savannas. And the first one is that savannas are found throughout the world. In the Midwest, or in North America, we have the oak savanna, and that oak savanna is found in the transition zone between the forest and the prairie. And so that strip of land happens to overlap with a lot of our cropland, our most productive cropland in the United States, and that's no accident. This transition zone is a place where there's adequate rainfall for full forest to develop, but because of historical disturbances and we'll get into what disturbance means, those succession has been held back. And a mix between prairie grasslands and forest ecosystem has resulted in an ecosystem that has a lot of structural variability. So there's room for lots of different plant types from the prairie biome and the forest biome, and some that are adapted specifically to the savanna ecosystem. So plants of all types, this can maximize the sunlight capture at different times of day, at different intensities of sunlight, and different times of year. There's a solar collector, a leaf at some angle, including shade adapted leaves to capture that filtered sunlight coming through. And the other point about the structural variability is that it includes a lot of diversity of animals within it as well. Savannas are also exceptionally productive ecosystems. This is a very busy slide, so don't worry about trying to understand it all. But the point is, on the x-axis, we have biomass production, and on the y-axis, we have consumption by herbivores. And those are two things that we look for in agricultural systems. We want them to be productive in terms of the plants we're growing and the animals that we're raising. And all these different letters are different types of ecosystems. The S's are savannas, and you can see they are among the most productive. So that's what we're looking for in agricultural systems as well. The last point is that savannas need disturbance. Historically, that disturbance has been provided by fire and large herbivores. Today, farmers disturb. That's what they do. Whenever they are mowing vegetation or using livestock to remove or alter vegetation, this is a disturbance. So this is an ecosystem process that we see mimicked already in agricultural systems. And an important point here too is that plowing or cultivation of the soil is also a disturbance that resets an ecosystem to what we call primary succession. We see this in annual agriculture, but in the savanna, it's an intermediate level of disturbance. So it's leaving some of the vegetation intact while altering some other parts of it. So to recap, why savannas? Across the landscape, they're distributed globally, so there's lots of places where this model might be applied. In the US, it's on some of our richest soils and most productive regions. Biologically, there's lots of different niches for different types of crops and animals we might want to raise. And savannas themselves are a very productive biome. Culturally, disturbance is what farmers do, so we can mimic that process in the way that we farm. And the last thing I'll say, sort of tongue-in-cheek, is that we like trees. And we like grass too, but prairies were already taken by our friends at the Land Institute in Kansas. So we're agroforesters at heart. We like tree crops. And the earnest part of this is that there's an aesthetic element to this as well. There's farmers' intuition tell them that in this part of the earth, in this part of the world where we're looking to revegetate agricultural lands, the savannas provide a model. This is what food systems that regenerate the land might look like. So I'll get into that a little bit more at the end, but I think it's worth noting that there's more to this than just the scientific approach, although that's where most of our focus is. So our inspiration is the natural oak savanna, which we've just gone through, and the innovation that we're going to is the managed savanna agroecosystem. But most of our work is in the middle here, in research and development. And I'll talk a little bit today about managed savanna agroecosystems, farms where this is working and happening, but by and large, there are not a lot of commercial models for farms that mimic the savanna. And so there's a lot of work in the research and development in getting to that point. which is what I'll be talking about primarily today. So when we think about farms that look like a savanna, I think it's useful to compare them to the farms that we have today. And so on the right, you can see in the photograph a cornfield, and it's next to, on the left, a savanna-mimicking agroecosystem. And this is at the University of Illinois. This is their woody perennial polyculture research site. And the point here is to compare side by side these two models for agriculture. And so on the right, we have an agroecosystem that's primarily based on herbaceous plants, whereas savannas importantly include woody vegetation like trees, shrubs, and vines. And on the right, these are primarily annual crops, plants that need to be replanted each year. And on the left, in savannas, we see primarily perennial vegetation, as is the case in most natural ecosystems. And on the right, again, in our conventional or our dominant agricultural systems, most plants are grown in monoculture, whereas in the savanna, in most natural ecosystems, we see mixes of plants and animals growing together, known as polyculture. So what does this woody perennial polyculture look like in the savanna? Well, again, getting at the structural variability in savannas, we see a mix of canopy trees, medium-sized trees, shrubs, brambles, grasses, and vines. You could also add fungus and animals to this as well. And if we take these layers and think about what it might look like in a farming system, we can take these same structural layers and think about species that are already growing in the natural savanna, but might have some potential as a food crop. So in natural savannas, we see oak and pine, which yield nuts. In medium trees, we see lots of different types of wild fruits. The same is true of the shrubs. I'm not going to read all these, but you can read them. The cane layer also has lots of different fruits. The ground layer, we see many different types of grasses and forbs and other plants that may be useful directly as human food, or things that animals that we eat or that provide products we use might be able to eat. That's true also of the nuts and fruits. And then fungus, of course, as well. Now, if we take these example natural species, we've already talked about how natural ecosystems don't provide a whole lot of food calories that are at least easily harvestable for humans. But we can look at domesticated or horticultural varieties of these species that might be substituted in an agricultural savanna. So while we might want to grow oak in our savanna agriculture and feed those acorns to livestock, for example, we might decide instead that we want to grow something like chestnut, another canopy tree, a cousin in the same family as oak, that produces a valuable nut for which there's a large market globally, and we can grow many varieties of Chinese chestnut and hybrids with other chestnut species that will grow in the agricultural regions of the US. And instead of crabapple following the same pattern, we might grow horticultural varieties of apple. And the same is true of stone fruits. And going right down the list through these different layers of this savanna, instead of growing wild hazelnut, we might grow European or hybrid varieties that have the agronomic and economic characteristics that we're looking for to meet the market demand. And the same is true of these small fruits. And an important point here with, again, with the wild grape is that maybe we don't want to grow grapes. It could be a challenge in the Midwest where there's high humidity, but we might grow hops or hardy kiwi to fill that vine or liana niche in the ecosystem instead. Grasses and forbs, here it's important again to point out that these can be of use to livestock if they're not of direct use to humans, or we might even look at native species like switchgrass that could be used for fuel, or species that might be used to serve other functions besides direct food production, like soil rehabilitation. And there are lots of mushrooms that can be grown for food and or medicine, like Steve Gabriel talked about on this same webinar series, growing log-grown shiitake mushrooms. So that's the basic idea of savanna agriculture here, or savanna-mimicking agroecosystems. And the resulting products that you get supply what we might call a balanced or healthy diet. And this is sort of intuitive, given that humans did emerge from a savanna ecosystem, that our physiology would be adapted to these sorts of foodstuffs. And I think it's important to point out here as well that livestock raised on pasture, or livestock that are eating things besides annual crops, more and more we're learning about the health benefits of that as well. So that might be all well and good, you could say, but these are essentially seem like specialty crops. And mentioning those annual grains that most of our livestock are fed, if we're not providing a substitution for that, then we're really just playing in the sandbox or nicking away at the edges of the main agricultural system. But we think there is potential within this model to provide commodity scale industrial feedstocks from agriculture. And the two core crops that we look to for this potential, although there are others, are chestnuts and hazelnuts. And as we call them, corn on trees and soy on trees, the reason we see that potential, although I talked about that, I didn't talk about it, but there are some challenges we're still going through to domesticate these crops so that they're suitable for this large-scale production. We see the potential there because when you look at the nutritional profiles of these crops, essentially what corn and soy provide us are starch and protein and oil. And chestnuts, just like corn, are that starch source with high percentage of carbohydrates. And hazelnuts, like soybean, are primarily protein and oil. So there's a lot of potential here to do that substitution. And I won't go into a whole lot of detail on this. There are studies that are going on right now to look at this substitution in the processing environment. But it's important to make this point as we think about the potential wide-scale applicability of eco-mimicry to agriculture. If you're not familiar with these crops, just a few photos to get you up to speed. On the left there is a research chestnut orchard at Badger Set in Minnesota. And then those are hybrid chestnuts, crosses between Chinese and American chestnut. You can see the burrs growing on the tree, and then the in-shell nut on the right. Again, this is a major crop worldwide, gaining traction in the United States. This is a wild American hazelnut in the University of Wisconsin Arboretum next to a bee balm flower here, just for scale, but to give you a sense of what this looks like growing on the plant. Another potential canopy tree I didn't mention are nuts in the juglin family. Walnuts, all different kinds of walnuts, hickory nuts, and pecans are all in this family. Mentioned lots of different kinds of fruit, and again, livestock. These systems can be designed to meet the different nutritional requirements of various livestock. Sheep cleaning out or helping manage a nut orchard in southeast Wisconsin here, and pigs in southwest Wisconsin eating fallen fruit and nuts, and producing a very high value product as a result that improves the returns to the farmers. So it sounds like something of a miracle, doesn't it? We can have this ideal system where we can provide ecosystem services, we can produce very nutritious crops, and farmers can make a lot of money and have a viable livelihood doing it. Well, in reality, there's a reason everybody's not doing all this just yet. There are still a lot of challenges and risks to doing it. And they're manifold, and I'm not going to get into all of them today, but it's worth a list here, because some of this does direct the way that we go about our work, is addressing these risks and challenges. Some of those are at the farm level. Profitability, of course, is always at the forefront of what makes a farm work or not. With these systems in particular, there can be trade-offs between trying to provision those ecosystem services while at the same time producing saleable crops. And in some cases, those aren't necessarily in opposition, such as with pollinators, but there are oftentimes trade-offs. And then when we're talking about polycultures, complexity of management is also an issue. And that's true in a lot of cases, but especially when it comes to harvest, there can be a balance or a trade-off between diversity and efficiency. So those are all challenges that farmers have to face. And then beyond what farmers can do at the level of their own farm, there are challenges in crop development. We touched on the work being done domesticating hazelnut, for example. And then farmer development as well. Many of the people who are interested in farming in this model did not grow up on farms. And so, but as we know, the average age of farmers continues to increase in this country. So we need to provide training opportunities for farmers to learn how to do this. And then they need access to land with secure tenure for these long-term perennial crops to develop. And then they need markets where they can sell these crops, and where necessary, they need to aggregate their crops with other farmers, have them processed in a way that meets that market demand, and then be distributed so consumers can access it. And there are various levels of progress towards meeting each of these challenges, but it is an ongoing process. So this is where the Savanna Institute comes in. Our vision is to move towards an optimal and resilient agriculture industry inspired by the savanna biome. And our mission is to work with people throughout the industry, throughout value chains, to enhance practices that are associated with this resilient agricultural system. At this stage, we're a young, essentially startup organization, and we've focused primarily on working with farmers because that's where we think a lot of things start, and we think it's where we can make the most traction at this point. And there's, as you'll see, quite a number of farmers who are interested in doing this. So this lays out a little bit of our strategy towards accomplishing that. I won't go into much detail, but to give you an idea of how we're oriented. We have just started a new project here. We haven't launched it publicly yet. We're trying to work out as many bugs as we can before we launch publicly. But this is a website that's essentially a map of perennial agriculture. And each of these dots is a different place or person or farm that is involved in perennial agriculture. And we've made the scope for this perennial agriculture because whether it's a farm that has an orchard with a single crop, or whether it's a farm that raises animals on pasture, those are perennial systems, and they have some of the building blocks towards this integrated savanna model of agriculture. And you can put that in the context of potential adopters is the language that's used sometimes. And then beyond farmers, we have, if you look in the lower left at the legend, people who are aspiring farmers but are looking for land, and people who are landowners looking for farmers, supply and service providers that offer support to farmers as a business, food marketers and buyers who are purchasing the crops that farmers are raising, and then research and education organizations like the Savanna Institute, like the Center for Agroforestry. And then we have this tab on the upper left, search, includes a fairly sophisticated filter where if you're looking for farms that grow chestnuts and raise pigs, you can select, for example, those two things, and then your map will include dots that have those components. Or if you're interested in specific fencing or water management practices, we have some of those things included in the search filter as well. So this is our way in the big picture of trying to gather anyone who might be interested in this and provide opportunities for them to learn from each other and to connect with each other beyond even what the Savanna Institute is able to do directly working with stakeholders. On a more direct level, we work with farmers doing outreach and education. This is a field day in southeast Wisconsin. Field days are some of our favorite ways of promoting this knowledge exchange. We also hold an annual farmer gathering. I'll talk about a little bit ahead here. We have a directory of technical assistance providers that can help farmers get off the ground if they're looking for someone who has more experience or expertise than they do with a particular aspect of planning or implementing their farming system. And then in general, we work to address hurdles in the development of this agricultural system. Our annual farmer gathering has been a real favorite among the farmers and the organization. It's been doubling in size each year, so we look forward to continuing to widen our circle this way. And one of the really great things about this gathering is that we devote some time to getting feedback directly from farmers in a listening session. And so, for example, 2 years ago, farmers were telling us they wanted more information and more research about integrating livestock into these Savanna agriculture systems. And you'll see coming up here some of the research that we've developed in response. And this year, just a couple months ago, we had our gathering, and we heard from farmers that they wanted more mentorship. And so we're working on developing proposals and plans for a mentorship program. And
now, folks, Keith, this is Gregory. Are you
yes.
about to move on to the next slide? Just have to interject here. This is where we had to
Yes.
split the presentation in two. So, folks, just bear with us 1 second while we adjust the presentation here. We had some problems with the compression and conversion of the files, so we just needed to split into two. Here we go.
Okay, thank you, Gregory.
In just a second.
So the farmer gathering is open to anyone who's working with us in a variety of ways. Our case study program is where we work more intensively with individual farms in a participatory manner to do research and provide educational opportunities in Savanna-based agriculture. And I'll lay this program out a little bit for you. We've had a lot of interest in it from farmers around the Midwest and farmers from other regions as well, but we've continued to focus in the Midwest. This map is from a couple years ago, so there are substantial, in a contemporary map would include more dots. These are people who've applied to the program, and the green and the yellow on the map here are the corn and soy acreage from 2014. So you can see that these are in, our intent is really to work with farms that are on productive farmland. Again, not just in marginal areas, although there's important work to be done there as well. Part of the reason that we launched the Perennial Map that I showed you a few slides ago is that the case study program wasn't a good fit for everybody who was interested in interfacing with us. Perhaps they weren't ready to engage in farming just yet. They were still in preparation or training, or perhaps they were involved in some other aspect of the food system besides farming themselves. But those farmers who have become case studies, they're some of my personal heroes, and it's been a real joy and honor to work with them. They're real people that work hard and devote extra time in addition to their hard work on the farm to collecting information and sharing it to try to further goals that are of benefit beyond their own individual farm. And as part of joining the case study program, these farmers share their designs or their plans for their farm. So this is part of us documenting what's happening on the farms. And so I'm not going to get into detail on this, but I'll show you a few of these plans just so you can get a sense of the diversity among and within the farms. You can see there's a wide range of crops and spatial arrangements. You'll see a little bit more about the scale these farms are at in another slide coming up here. But this is just really exciting to see visually how the landscape is changing from the bird's eye view. And sometimes the computer eye view. This is a farm that's including currants as an understory intercrop with various types of nut trees. And this is a species list of what farms working with us are planting this year. These are plants that we help supply to farmers through our bulk plant program, which is associated with the research of our case study program and allows us to have some sense of what the genetic background or material is going in on these farms as we assess the performance of these plants growing on the farms across different farms and throughout the region. So again, a lot of diversity here. And the other thing I'll say about the bulk plant program is part of the reason it came into existence as well is because when you're planting a very diverse farm, especially if you're doing it for the first time, understanding which nurseries supply these different plants and which are going to supply the best adapted for your needs is a substantial process that can be a hurdle for a beginning farmer. So we're helping overcome that hurdle. Getting into the case study in particular, what we do, our goal is to provide quantitative evaluation of growth, yield, economics, and environmental sustainability of these farms. And the way that we do that is, again, participatory. On the Savanna Institute side, we're gathering data in a variety of ways, as you can see here. And on the farmer side, we've divided our case studies into different tiers as we learn what's feasible for farms at different stages and capacities. Some farms, just even before I put that on there, some farms will just allow us to come and gather any of this data that we're interested in, or as other projects come up, to contact them about working with them on those research projects. And they'll provide us a plan or a map or a list of what they have growing on their farm. Other farms will gather data on a sort of limited basis, looking primarily at the survival of the crops that they're planting, their growth, and their yield, doing those census on an annual or spread out basis, year 1, 3, 5, 10. And this gives us just a basic picture of how these farming systems are developing and performing. And then farmers that are willing and able to work with us in a more intensive manner will collect a more comprehensive set of data that includes their finances, their labor, and other inputs and what they cost, and then their management strategies as well. This is a screenshot of the data collection form that we provide for these farmers. Some farmers like this because they don't, especially if they're beginning farmers and they don't have a template for record keeping, this provides them a means and some motivation to do it. And but other farmers, it's a difficulty, and that's why we've broken our case study program into different tiers of engagement. Just to give you some brief results, to give you an idea of some of the utility of the data that we collect this way, here's 8 case study farms in different columns. Acres give you some sense of the scale of these enterprises, whether they include animals. And then expenses. In year 1, those are establishment expenses for implementing, planting these systems, and then for some of these farms, year 2 expenses as well. You can see it goes down substantially, and then the labor that's involved as well. These kinds of numbers are some of the first questions that farmers who are interested in getting started are asking. What does it cost? How much time is it going to take me? And we can only speculate unless we have actual numbers from actual farms that are doing it. We found that some of the other first questions that people ask have to do with the management of what do I actually do that's going to allow me to successfully establish these systems. And while we found that there's value in the young farms that have done it, and there's value in learning from information that's out there about single crop enterprises, we went to farms that have successful diverse agroforestry plantings and interviewed them to find out what their best management practices are in establishment. I'm not going to talk about which individual farms we went to because we haven't gone through all the confidentiality protocols for that. But this is a photo from some folks from the Union of Concerned Scientists came and joined us on one of these interviews and tours, and here we are enjoying the fruits of a mature seaberry shrub. And this was an experimental planting with dozens of different kinds of unusual fruits, and a very experienced farmer who could tell us what's worked well and what hasn't. Another photograph here from a farm in Minnesota to make some of you agroforesters in the crowd drool a little bit. This is a high-density orchard interplanted with multiple different crops and understory components within the context of a windbreak here. This is another farm in Minnesota where they put hazelnut seedlings in nursery beds for growing season and then planted them out in the fall after renovating a pasture with livestock to prepare for that planting. We're a part of actually monitoring the success of that planting. This is a farm in Iowa where they're interplanting pawpaw and aronia with chestnut. This is a successful commercial enterprise that there's a lot to learn from on what's made that, both from a horticultural and a market perspective, successful. Same farm here with honeyberry starting under mature chestnut trees. Here's an asparagus alley crop in a chestnut planting. And here you can see sheep helping to manage a hickory and pecan orchard. So I show you these just as snapshots, one to get a sense of what mature systems look like, and two to show you how we're starting to engage with established farms to help farms that are just beginning get started. Here's hogs cleaning up a raspberry patch as well, and chickens in a young planting of a savanna that's also a conservation planting. So not going to get into a lot of details on what we learned, but we did learn that a lot of solutions for each of these farms are site specific based on the characteristics of the land there, that young plantings do need to be protected. Even experienced farmers continue to learn from trial and error, and that for many of these less common perennial crops, demand continues to outstrip supply. So there is room for more farms to be growing them, even without substantial market development. But profit margins are a difficult thing for many farmers to grok because there can be high cost associated, and so price points need to be correspondingly high. And there's a lot of interest out there in collaborating and sharing resources, especially among younger farmers that, again, need assistance from experienced farmers and are looking for mentorship and other types of learning opportunities. not to get into a whole lot of details here, but a lot of we're trying to pull a lot of this into a comprehensive guide for preparing and implementing and establishing these diverse agroforestry plantings. We are also moving in our case study program towards more targeted research and outreach beyond just collecting this sort of baseline data towards more hypothesis-driven research. We had got support from USDA SARE in the last year to study crop performance, pests, and pollinators on 4 different farms in our case study program in Illinois. And that's allowed us to work more intensively on some of these farms. For example, starting to get some results in from that project. This didn't come out very clearly in the conversion, but these 4 different bars are 4 different field types. On the top, we have row crops, and then all the different colors are different arthropod orders. So row crops, hay, forest, and the agroforestry plantings on these farms. You can see, even without much in the way of statistics, that there are some differences in the diversity and abundance of arthropods within these different land use types that we're starting to document. And again, these are young systems, so this does also provide some baseline information. Another area of targeted research and outreach for us is in silvopasture establishment. We're just launching another project funded by a partnership grant from SARE. And the target of this project is to look at establishing silvopasture on farms with livestock that don't have available mature trees, and so they're planting seedling trees into open pastures, and so comparing different methods for establishing and protecting those seedling trees. And then another cool part of this project is that those beginning farmers who are doing the trials on their farms are also going to go out and interview experienced silvopastoralists, and we'll edit those interviews down and put them out as podcasts. And then we'll also make those podcasts and other findings that come out from this project available on our Perennial Map, which you saw a number of slides ago. It will be a place for people who are practicing silvopasture that are geographically dispersed to exchange knowledge and share information with each other. The other silvopasture establishment research that we're doing is in degraded oak savannas in southern Wisconsin, where instead of an open pasture, it's a closed canopy woods that we're thinning the canopy and the brush layer there, and then comparing areas with and without rotational grazing, seeing how those trees regenerate and the brush comes back, and how we can potentially establish native and improved forages with or without those cattle. And since there is a long history of wooded lands being degraded by livestock, we're also looking at what's happening to the soil with those livestock present. This is one of those methods called an arbor shield for protecting seedling trees from livestock. We're also broadening our scope to work with universities and institutional collaborators, both to help them find farms where they can do research, to do collaborative research, to help universities in outreach. I think getting down on time, so I'm not going to go into the particular projects that we have going with each of these different universities, but this has been a great way for us to expand our capacity. And a couple of notes here. This aerial photo with the superimposed schematic, you can see a lot of listeners, if you're not aware, might be interested to learn more about this. This is the multifunctional woody polyculture research trial at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, where they're comparing both annual and perennial monocultures with woody perennials grown in various diversity and densities of polyculture, and then looking at various agronomic and environmental parameters associated with those different with those different planting styles. And then they also have a native plant treatment that is hyper diverse and looks more like a conservation planting. So looking to try to find where's the sweet spot between annual row crop monoculture and a conservation planting that's not designed for agricultural uses. As you can see, there's room at the bottom of this list for more collaborations. Really pleased again to be a part of this webinar and hope it's a start for more collaboration between the Savanna Institute and the Center for Agroforestry, and any of you others listening out there as well that are interested in collaborating. Please do be in touch, and let's see what we can do together. A couple of last things that I want to point out before I finish here. For those of you in the Midwest, we do have a field day coming up in about a month here at a farm we've been working with for a couple of years near Peoria, Illinois. We actually had our farmer gathering there this year, and we'll be planting a shelter belt there for the field day and talking about the whys of designing and planting a shelter belt. So invite you to come out and join us for that. And then on the right here is our perennial report. So there you see we're learning that we might produce a perennial report instead of an annual report. And so lots of other things that I haven't talked about today that we're doing. And I encourage you to get in touch and learn more about what we're doing if you're interested and would like to get involved. I'll just say that our big picture here that I want to end on is that we're really interested in agroforestry as a means for agriculture to be managing ecosystems. And just like the field of forestry has really moved beyond simply producing timber to managing ecosystems, agriculture is poised to move beyond just producing crops to providing these multiple other functions that we look to from ecosystems. So agroforestry, alongside range management and other fields of agroecology, I think is poised really well to develop these systems. So this is my encouragement to you agroforesters listening out there is let's put our knowledge base and our skills and our understanding of systems to work not only to help on the edges of systems, the buffers, the waterways, the windbreaks, that are all very important, but let's think about the production centers of agriculture as well and what agroforestry has to offer for that. We've seen that islands of diversity within these large areas of monoculture, it doesn't work for a lot of reasons. I've been thinking a lot about pollinators lately, and I think that's a good example of why we need perennial diverse landscapes. And I think that awareness of this is growing too. Pollinators, again, are a good example of that. And I think there's going to be a lot of interest, including consumer interest, in food that comes with a story that it's restoring ecosystems, and that maybe it's not going to be enough for us to eat our way out of climate change, for example, but I think there's a lot of research to be done to find out what agriculture can contribute to solving climate change and other environmental problems, rather than just us trying to be on the defensive and limit the amount of damage that agriculture is doing. So with that, I want to thank again the University of Missouri Center for Agroforestry for having me on here today. Really a pleasure and an honor. I want to thank all the farmers that we work with and their hard work in the fields and for the greater benefit. And I want to thank my collaborators at SI, the board members and staff members and people who volunteer. I couldn't do this without them, and a lot of what I've shown you here today is a result of their hard work. And so I want to give a lot of credit to the people that I work with as well. And so with that, happy to
Keefe,
entertain questions.
thank you so much for such an excellent presentation. Really, I'm just so thrilled and just so excited with what the Savanna Institute is doing and planning. So much look forward to following up and learning more, and absolutely look forward to exploring a collaboration between the Center for Agroforestry and Savanna Institute. So Again, thanks for the presentation. Folks, we're going to open up a question and answer session now. If you just bear with me 1 second, I'll open up a question pod here, question and answer pod, and if you could put your questions right into this pod I'm opening up here. Hopefully people can see that. There should be a dialog box down below, and I'll stretch this out. There we go. I see some questions coming in already. So let's move that here, and it works a little better if we put our questions into the question and Q&A box rather than the chat box. Maybe Keefe, while some questions are coming in, I'll ask you just a quick question. In some of the chestnut systems, in some of the farms with chestnuts, curious to know if any or many are grazing large animals, cattle on those, and integrated with the chestnuts, and how what some of the experiences there have been, if you're aware of any.
So the question is, other examples of large animals
grazing on under
chestnut
systems. Yeah.
You know, I'm not grazing under chestnuts. Yeah, so there's a limited number of mature chestnut producers in the Midwest. Some of those include Mark Shepard's New Forest Farm, Phil Rutter's Badger Set Farm, Tom Wall's Red Fern Farm. Those are all Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa. And I know that both Mark and Phil and the other folks at those farms are raising livestock underneath those mature chestnuts. Tom, to my knowledge, is not. But there's definitely a lot of synergy there, both in managing the orchard and even in utilizing the chestnuts.
Yeah, it's something I'm interested in and look forward to. We're potentially going to establish some demonstration of chestnut silvopasture at one of our research farms, and so it's something I'll follow up with you and look more into. Keefe, can you see the question from? Go ahead.
I should mention too. You might check too with University of Kentucky, Craddock Hill. They're starting to do some silvopasture in their chestnuts as well.
Keefe, can you see Cheng Q's question? He's got a 3-part question there, starting with, how do you convince Midwestern farmers to join the case study program, or convince them to transition to such savanna-mimicking agroecosystems in general? Do you care to have a crack at any of Cheng Q's questions?
Yeah, let me start with that question. That's a great question, and I'm glad that you asked it. We really have not focused on trying to convince farmers to do anything, really. We're trying to keep up with the farmers that are interested in doing this already. There's a lot of interest out there, and rather than trying to convince farmers to change their ways, we're trying to promote and support those farmers that are already doing these innovative things. And I think that as those farmers improve their systems and as successful examples emerge, there'll be a natural attraction towards these systems if in fact it is successful on a large scale. So rather than trying to force the issue, I think that the best approach that we've found, or our strategy, is to try to make those people who are interested in this already as successful as they can be, and to help them to share their successes with others who already want to learn about it. I'll just jump in here to the other questions that have been posed by Cheng. That the sprout map is limited to perennial farmers because it was the best umbrella that we could find that would actually draw a line somewhere. And where do you draw the line is always a hard thing. And it was too much for us to think about including all farms, and thinking about what makes an ecological farm. I think it's an important question, but it's a hard question to answer. But those farms that have perennial crops and practices already are poised to adopt more diversified agroforestry practices already. So that's been our target. And the map is open to, or will be as soon as we launch it, to anyone. So as soon as you have a perennial crop or practice on your farm, you can join the map. But until then, you're welcome to see all the other farms that are doing it and learn from them. And the last thing that I do want to address too from Cheng is the question about Mark Shepard's term restoration agriculture. And as those of us who've been following us know, we use the term restoration agriculture quite a bit as well. I haven't used it a lot in this presentation because while I think that Mark has laid out a brilliant example of how ecomimicry can work, and we've learned a lot from Mark and benefited a lot from his work, that there's also openings to others that are coming from different parts of agroforestry and perennial agriculture as well. So it's mainly a matter of language and trying to keep it as open as possible for farmers who want to adopt
Very
this.
good. Keefe, would you like to continue with some of the additional questions here? For example, from Lirian Israeli. Do you have examples for agroforestry systems from farms in Mediterranean climates? And
yeah, so the premier example of agroforestry systems in Mediterranean climates that I'm somewhat familiar with is the Dehesa system in the Iberian Peninsula, encompassing 5 million or so acres in Spain and Portugal, where they're growing, I think, primarily cork oak, which is used to make the cork in wine bottles and other such things. But these savanna systems, also the acorns, feed swine, which is used to produce the Iberian ham, which is very high value in the market, and it also raises other types of livestock, cattle as well. So that's a well-established system that's been around for hundreds, if not thousands of years.
yeah, there sure are,
I think there are
systems
probably other
from
examples in the
Italy,
Mediterranean
Greece, and
climate as
Turkey
well
with
that I'm not
olives or
familiar
other
with.
trees that are integrated polycultures, and certainly from Mediterranean climate areas of Latin America. And Liren certainly could follow up with you to help identify and find some of those examples of agroforestry systems in Mediterranean climates. Keefe, are you able to see some of the additional questions here? Is there anyone that you would particularly like to have a respond to?
Yeah, I can respond to Justin briefly. The question of what support do we need from nurseries? One of the major costs in establishing these systems is the cost of the planting stock. So we need to continue to drive the costs down for planting stock, but we also need to drive the quality up. And quality can mean a lot of things, but a lot of nursery stock is not adapted for horticultural purposes. And there are important exceptions to that, and we work with nurseries that are providing really good stock for agricultural and horticultural purposes. But we need more of that basically. And a lot of the breeding and selection, I think, is out of the hands of nursery, but just staying up to date with what's coming out of breeding programs and pushing universities and research institutions to continue those breeding programs, and continuing to push policy from an industry perspective to say that we need public support for plant breeding, especially in perennial crops, which have unique challenges for breeding. I would say all of that are things that nurseries can offer.
Thank you, Keefe. Just following up before we move on to another question, Art Aplan makes an important point that in response to Cheng Q's initial question, that of course to promote adoption and convince Midwestern farmers to join case study programs, so you need to start from where they're at and from their point of view. And that change on any level in farming takes some work and knowledge, research, and motivation, etc. Thank you, Art, for that comment. Moving on, Keefe, I'm noticing questions from Rennie Eppenstein and Meredith Wecker that look pretty interesting. If you care to address those, from Rennie Eppenstein, first question In terms of efficient harvest management of polycultures, to what extent has an effort been made to stagger out harvests in order to keep complexity and labor demands low, or to manage complexity and labor demands?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question, and a couple of points that come to mind for that. One is just the use of livestock. There's a lot of complexity in trying to harvest some of these crops that take a fair amount of processing or have food safety or challenges to mechanical harvesting, but those are non-issues with livestock. And as the demand grows for livestock that that have healthy, sustainable feedstuffs, pasture-raised livestock, I think that's one way to keep complexity and labor low. The other, and staggering out harvest can help feed those livestock over the course of a season as well. The other thing I'll mention when we're talking about food for direct human consumption, simple polycultural systems, so to speak, where it involves, say, one tree crop and one understory woody crop. We're putting together a proposal right now with the University of Illinois to look at currants, which have particular shade tolerance under single canopy crops. And so trying to examine shade tolerance and performance under a variety of different shade and the potential to integrate currants into existing orchards. And the idea there is that currants do mature earlier in the season, so that would stagger out the harvest. And because we're looking at just two crops, that can keep the complexity a little bit lower than the full tilt array of all these species. And I should say that we don't promote any particular strategy for farmers. This is an idea, and then we look to the farmers to innovate the particular combinations of species that work on their farms in terms of the farm and what the markets bear and what their labor and other
Thank you, Keith. I
capacities
think
are.
we've got about one or two more questions, and then we can maybe address some of the comments. Keith, could we move to Meredith Wecker's question? When you are mimicking the scattered tree density of the savanna system, how do you balance light penetration for grasses, forbs below, with tree spacing for optimal pollination? Obviously, can be a concern with chestnuts. Any thoughts on that, Keith?
I think that's a great question that deserves more research. This current research project that we're proposing, I just described, is going to get at that a little bit at measuring the photosynthetically active light spectrum coming through the canopy for those understory crops. But we're not involved in any research on tree spacing for optimal pollination. I think it's, again, a great question.
And, I think we'll take a final question from Rennie Eppenstein before we move on to some comments. And her question, the second of her questions, have there been interactions with larger wildlife in some of these savannas? How is larger wildlife managed that might interfere with the farmer's production?
Yeah, so the main large wildlife that interferes is white-tailed deer. As anybody who's planted trees in most of the upper Midwest knows, and probably a lot of the eastern United States at least, white-tailed deer are severely overpopulated in a lot of places. And so there's a major interference there, especially in the establishment phase of these tree-based farming systems. And so that's part of our silvopasture establishment research project that we're launching right now, is to look at management strategies to try to minimize interference. And silvopasture is, I think, going to be a good way to get at that, because with some types of livestock, there's a similar challenge as there are with deer. And so if we figure out good ways to keep, we'll be looking at both those things. We'll look at what happens to the trees when the livestock are in the paddocks where those trees are, and then we'll also monitor them when the livestock aren't present, which is basically when they're exposed only to the wildlife. And we have some time lapse cameras and those sorts of things as well to try to get at what the wildlife densities are. So there's a variety of different strategies, from fencing to poly tree tubes to metal cages to deterrents that are sensory based. And what we found is that a lot of it is site specific. So as to what works. So what we're hoping to get out of this are good case studies where farmers can say, this is my context, and this is what's worked for me. And then what it will probably come down to is farmers will have to see where the contexts seem most similar with successful examples, and then do their own trial and error to figure out what's going to work on their farm.
Okay, very good, Keefe. I think on some final notes here, Maria Spalletta is curious as whether there's possibilities for case study applications from Canada. And of course, from our side, we'd be interested to also coordinate with you about potential case study candidates from Missouri and surrounding states. Is that a possibility in the future? Is case studies from the oak savanna areas of southern central Canada?
Yeah, it certainly is a possibility. It's not something that we've done to date. As interest in this has started to grow, not just in our area of the Midwest, but elsewhere, we've had to face this question of again, where do we draw the boundaries? And so it's something we're actively negotiating and looking at strategically. One vision that we've talked about that we may pursue is looking to help establish sister organizations in other regions. So Missouri and oak savanna regions of Canada might be similar enough in climate and biome, et cetera, that it would make sense to be a part of the same case study cluster. But for people who are in California or who are in the southeastern U.S., there might be more to gain from being a part of a case study cluster with other farms in those areas. Yeah, so we're working on the best way to help facilitate that and share what we've learned in getting things going in this part of the Midwest. So I, again, welcome anybody here who didn't have their questions answered or who has more to discuss to get in touch with me. And
yeah, very good. Thank you, Keefe. I think we've addressed most, or if not all, of the questions, and we can certainly follow up with all the participants. We'll certainly I'll forward you any the question list and there's an opportunity and share contact information so people could follow up in the future. Just addressing some of the final comments there, Mike Gold pointed out that the chestnut silvopasture project in Kentucky is called Hillcratic. Mike, I'm going to enable your mic here if you're still with us in case you have any additional comments. And also moving on to another comment from Anastasia Pantera, who asked about tree protection from livestock, and that's a great question. I noticed, Keefe, in your Hillcratic is the name of the person with the animal civil and chestnut operation in Kentucky. Thank you, Mike. Mike, your microphone is enabled if you care to chime in here. Yeah, getting back to let's see, Anastasia Pantera is asking about tree protection, and Keefe, I noticed in the presentation you had an image, a slide there with one of those arbor shields. That's a new product available for tree protection during establishment. I think it was developed in Spain to help with regeneration in the dehesa, and it has these kind of barbs and sunk in with rebar. We may be trialing that with some other tree protection approaches in a new hardwood silvopasture we'll be establishing this year. But it'd be interesting to learn more of the experiences with that arbor shield. It's a bit pricey, but it seems to work as far as I can tell. Mike Gold has his approach in building, improvised or farmer-made shelters for newly established trees, and we'll be comparing some of those in our silvopastures. But Keefe, any final comments?
No, I'd just say that we should follow up and compare notes on these tree establishment trials with different protection methods. It'd be good if we had our methods line up enough that we could compile some of these results and maybe work
Yeah,
together
it
on
is a
sharing those results in outreach
very
as well.
important consideration, and certainly in trying to promote silvopasture and secure more adoption, that phase of establishment. And if you can change the equation on not taking any pasture out of production while the trees are being established, that could be can be a very important consideration and kind of change the balance. Will, if there's no further comments or questions, I think we can conclude here. Keefe, again, I want to thank you so much for such an excellent presentation and all the excellent work that the Savanna Institute is undertaking. We so much look forward to keeping in touch and following up with you and collaborating. I'm going to thank all of our participants for being with us today and for your support, and look forward to seeing you again on next month's Agroforestry in Action webinar. Next month will be with Antonio de Araujo, who will be presenting on agroforestry in southern Brazil. So with that, thanks to everyone, and see you next time. Bye-bye.